I woke up to a strange noise. At first, still caught in the sticky web of sleep, I couldn't understand what it was. A rustling? A knock? Maybe a branch scraping against the window? New York outside my window was holding its breath. A rare silence for the city that never sleeps. But inside my room, the air felt different. Heavy, as if it had absorbed something alien. Lying in the darkness, I listened intently. My heart was pounding so loudly it seemed the rhythm alone could wake the neighbors. Carefully, I turned onto my side, my eyes scanning the outlines of the furniture. Familiar shadows suddenly seemed unnatural. Knock, knock. Now it was clear. It wasn't the wind. The source was inside my apartment. My hand trembled as I reached for the phone on my bedside table. I lit up the screen, and the dim glow illuminated a small portion of the room. Calling the police was out of the question. Panic had paralyzed me. Thoughts swirled in my head. Was the door locked? Had I checked the windows? A shadow. I saw it for just a moment. In the hallway between the bedroom and the kitchen, something darted past. My heart stopped for an instant, and I froze. And then I moved. Yes, I moved, even though everything inside me screamed, "Don't do this." My head spun, but my legs carried me forward on their own. I still clutched the phone in my hand, a pitiful excuse for a weapon. I turned on the flashlight. The beam of light picked out fragments of the hallway, but there was no one there. And then I saw him. Jacob was standing at the end of the hallway, leaning against the wall. His face was barely visible in the dim light, but his eyes, those eyes I had known since childhood, they always held something warm, familiar. But now that warmth was gone, replaced by something cold, almost foreign. Jacob? My voice was barely more than a whisper. He didn't answer. He just stared. And then, as if he dissolved into thin air, he was gone. In the next instant, the hallway was empty and my legs refused to move. I was alone again, but now with the terrible realization. Something in my home had changed. And it wasn't just the shadows. The morning began with a nagging sense of unease, lurking in the corners of my mind. Fragments of the previous night's events surfaced in my memory, like a bad dream you can't fully recall. I tried to convince myself it had all been a dream, but the tremble in my hands and the barely suppressed fear betrayed the truth. It had been real. I headed to the nearest cafe on the corner, a small place that smelled of freshly baked croissants and rich espresso. It seemed like the bustle of the city might help me escape my own thoughts. But I was wrong. Jacob. He was there. He stood at the counter, perusing the menu. His relaxed posture, the slight smile as he said something to the barista. It all looked so ordinary, so implausibly normal that I began to doubt what had happened last night. Maybe it really was just a dream. "Hi, Jacob," I said, approaching and trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, hey." He turned, raising his eyebrows in surprise. "You're here too?" He seemed genuine, but I knew I couldn't just let it go. "Listen," I began, carefully choosing my words. "Were you at my place last night?" His expression froze for a split second. Then he chuckled, shaking his head slightly. "At your place? Last night?" "No, of course not. I wasn't anywhere near your apartment," he said with such confidence that it was hard to doubt him. "Maybe you're mistaken?" "No, I saw you," I insisted, trying to maintain my resolve, but my confidence wavered under his steady gaze. "Well, sorry, but it definitely wasn't me," he said with a shrug, retrieving his coffee from the counter and flashing a light smile. "Maybe it's just lack of sleep? Sometimes we all see things that aren't there." His words only deepened my unease. I watched him, searching for any sign of deception, but Jacob seemed so calm, so familiar that I began to question myself. Could I have been wrong? "Maybe you're right," I muttered, though every fiber of my being resisted the idea. "Well, it was nice seeing you," he said, giving me a wink. "I'll stop by for coffee sometime if you don't mind." And then he was gone, disappearing into the flow of people beyond the glass door. I watched him leave, feeling the anxiety coil tighter around me. He said he wasn't there, but something about his certainty seemed unnatural. And if it really wasn't him, then who had been standing in my hallway that night? The day went on, but the unease refused to let go of me. Memories of the night and my conversation with Jacob tangled in my mind, as if someone was deliberately throwing them back at me, forcing me to relive those moments over and over. I decided I needed a distraction, and nothing seemed more fitting than returning to the place that always brought me peace. The coastal town of my childhood greeted me with silence. Low houses, empty streets, the smell of salt in the air. I parked my car near my grandmother's old house. It had been abandoned for years. The paint had peeled away. The shutters hung crookedly. Yet, despite its dilapidation, this place still held the warmth of memories. I stepped inside, pushing open the creaky door. The scent of dust and aged wood felt like a greeting from the past. My attention was immediately drawn to a box in the corner of the living room. It bore markings in a child's handwriting. Our treasure. My heart tightened with a wave of nostalgia. Carefully, I lifted the lid. Inside were old letters, drawings, and small trinkets that Jacob and I had once considered treasures. I sat on the floor and began to sift through them. There were our scribbles, attempts to draw ships and pirate maps. But one note made me freeze. On a yellowed piece of paper were the words, "We must be careful. Someone is watching us." My heart began to race. The lines, written in my childish handwriting, were barely legible, but I knew for certain that I had written them. But what did it mean? Why had I written it? Who were we afraid of back then? I remembered how Jacob and I had built our base in the basement. Back then, it had felt as though the walls of the house protected us from the world outside. But now, staring at this note, I realized that even then we had sensed someone's presence. Someone's... but whose? Outside, a sound broke the stillness. A faint creak, as if someone had stepped on the old wooden planks of the porch. I flinched. Rising quickly, I slammed the box shut and headed for the door. There was no one on the porch. Only the wind stirred the dust on the road. But I knew. Someone had been here. Returning to the city brought no relief. My mind was overflowing with memories. The note from my childhood, the dusty basement, the feeling that someone had been watching me back then and still was now. I tried to rationalize it all. Surely it could just have been a child's fear, a product of imagination. But the sensations I'd experienced were far too vivid to ignore. The next day, hoping to distract myself, I decided to visit the farmer's market. There was something calming about the noise of the crowd, the fresh produce, the vibrant aromas of spices. I wandered between the stalls, searching for something that might restore a sense of stability. Instead of peace, though, I found Jacob again. He was standing at a stall selling rare spices, bent over the jars. I stopped, watching him. He seemed deeply focused, studying the labels as though trying to decipher some ancient recipe. I suddenly realized I couldn't just walk past. "Jacob?" I approached, trying to sound casual, though inside everything was churning. He turned, his face lighting up with a familiar smile. "Hey, what brings you here?" "The same as everyone else." I shrugged. "Browsing, looking for something interesting. What about you?" "Me?" He glanced at the jars in front of him, as though he'd forgotten why he was there. "Oh, just picking up some spices. I heard they've got a few rare ones here." He spoke calmly, but I couldn't shake the chill I'd felt when I saw him in my apartment that night. "Jacob," I began, taking a deep breath. "I'm still thinking about that night. Are you absolutely sure you weren't in my neighborhood?" He looked at me again, this time holding my gaze a little longer. "I'm sure," he said firmly. "I told you it couldn't have been me. Maybe you saw someone who looked like me?" His words made sense, but everything inside me rebelled against their logic. I decided to press further. "You know, it's strange. Back when we were kids, playing in Grandma's basement, I always had this feeling that someone was watching us. And now that feeling has come back." Jacob frowned. His relaxed posture vanished, replaced by a guarded tension. He dropped his gaze to the jars in front of him and muttered, "You always had an active imagination. Maybe it's just memories of what you thought was real back then." A tightness gripped my chest. He wanted to shut the topic down, while I wanted to figure it out. But pushing further felt pointless. His defenses were impenetrable. "Maybe you're right," I said, taking a step back. "All right, I won't bother you anymore. Enjoy your shopping." "Thanks," he replied with a nod, turning back to the spices. But I noticed his shoulders were slightly tense and his hands seemed to tremble as he tried to open one of the jars. I left the market with the distinct feeling that he was hiding something. Jacob didn't seem like a liar, but his behavior carried a new caution that hadn't been there before. Our conversation offered no answers, only deepened my doubts. One thing was now certain. To understand what was happening, I'd have to return to Grandma's basement. And this time, I might have to go deeper than Jacob and I ever dared to as children. Grandma's house looked even more abandoned than during my first visit. The rain over the past few days had left streaks of dirt on the windows, and the wooden planks on the porch seemed to sag under the weight of time. I stood in front of the door, a growing, inexplicable unease building within me. But I knew I had to do this. I had to go down into the basement. I carefully opened the door, which creaked loudly as if resisting my arrival. Inside it was dark, but I knew the way. Through the kitchen, then the old pantry, and in the corner, the door leading to the basement. I opened it, and a blast of cold, stale air hit my face. The basement was just as I remembered it. Low ceilings, peeling paint on the walls, and a floor riddled with cracks. I turned on my flashlight, illuminating the space. In the corner, our old wooden furniture still stood, a low table, a couple of chairs, and the crates we had used as storage for our treasures. On the wall nearby hung a drawing, a crude map marked with the places where we believed secrets were hidden. But now, everything felt different. Not nostalgically warm, but grim, alien. I approached one of the crates, opened it, and immediately came across an old tape recorder. This artifact from the past brought a flood of memories. Jacob and I used to record our games, our voices, as if we were reporters in an imaginary world. I picked up the tape recorder. It still looked functional, though the batteries were probably long dead. I pulled a couple of spare batteries from my flashlight and inserted them into the recorder. A click. The tape recorder whirred softly to life. There was a recording on the cassette. I pressed play. At first, it was just our voices. We laughed, argued, and made plans. I heard us discussing strange noises coming from behind the basement walls. "It's just the pipes," Jacob said in the recording. "Pipes make noise." But my younger self insisted, "No, it's not the pipes. Someone's there." And then the recording changed. Strange sounds interrupted our conversation. A faint whisper, barely discernible. I turned up the volume, straining to catch the words. "They see us?" said a distorted voice, followed by a noise like something heavy scraping against the ground. I turned off the recorder, trying to steady my rapid breathing. My heart was pounding so loudly it felt like it could echo in the basement's oppressive silence. I glanced around. It was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Suddenly, my flashlight began to flicker, and then it went out. I was plunged into total darkness, and the only sound I could hear was my own breathing. "Who's there?" My voice came out louder than I'd expected, but no one answered. And then, in the silence, I heard a noise. At first, it was faint, like someone shifting in place. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, drawing closer. I didn't wait to find out who it was. Grabbing the tape recorder, I bolted for the stairs. As I climbed, I stumbled but managed to pull myself up and out into the daylight, gasping for air, my hands trembling uncontrollably. Standing on the porch under the bright light of day, I knew one thing for certain. Something was in that house. Something that wouldn't let go of me, of Jacob, or perhaps of our past. I looked down at the tape recorder in my hands. It was the only piece of evidence of what I'd just experienced. And I knew I had to find out what the whisper on that tape meant, and why it felt so familiar. The next day, still shaken by my visit to the basement, I received a message from Jacob. He suggested we meet in Central Park. His words were casual. Just a walk, like old times. But something about the invitation felt off. It seemed as though there was a plea hidden beneath the simple phrase. We met by the fountain, its outlines softened by the gentle autumn light. Jacob looked as though he hadn't slept all night. His eyes were weary, but he carried himself with confidence, as if trying to mask his inner turmoil. "How are you?" he began, smiling. "Fine," I replied, trying not to let my emotions show. "And you?" "Not bad," he said, glancing away for a moment as though avoiding my gaze. "It's been a while since we just walked, hasn't it?" We started along a path lined with golden and crimson leaves. Around us, people strolled, children laughed, but the silence between us was heavy. I wanted to bring up the night, the basement, but I didn't know where to start. It seemed like he sensed my hesitation. "Is there something you want to ask?" Jacob suddenly stopped and looked at me. His eyes once again carried that mysterious coldness I had seen in my hallway that night. "Yes," I said, taking a deep breath. "I was in the basement." He didn't seem surprised. He just nodded, as if he'd been expecting me to say this. "And what did you find?" he asked calmly, though his voice trembled slightly. "An old tape recorder. We used to record our games on it, remember?" I paused, watching his reaction. His face remained unreadable. "There's a whisper on the tape. Someone was saying strange things as though they were watching us." Jacob lifted his gaze, and I saw a flicker of unease in his eyes. He pressed his lips together, as if deciding whether to say more. "Are you sure it's not just a bad recording? Or maybe our imagination?" He tried to smile, but it came out strained. "I'm sure," I said firmly. "You feel it too, Jacob. You've felt it from the start." He was silent for a long time, staring into the distance. I couldn't read his expression. His face, usually so open, was now closed, as though hiding 1,000 secrets. "You know, I really don't understand why this is all coming back now," he finally said. "Why everything we forgot is resurfacing all of a sudden. You know, we were kids. This could have all been just fantasies." But it wasn't. It was real. And you feel it too. Otherwise, you wouldn't be avoiding the topic of that night. "Jacob, what happened?" I looked into his eyes, trying to reach him. He dropped his gaze to the ground and said quietly, "I don't know, honestly, but I feel like this isn't random." His words only deepened my anxiety. He knew more than he was saying, but something was holding him back, as though an invisible force restrained him. We continued walking along the path. When we reached the end of the lane, Jacob stopped. His face softened, but his voice remained serious. "If you think something's wrong, we can figure it out together," he said. "But let's start with what's happening now, not what happened back then." I nodded, though I knew the present and the past were tied far more tightly than he wanted to admit. As I walked home, his final words echoed in my mind. One thing was clear. Jacob was afraid of something, and that fear was only bringing us closer to the truth. The days grew increasingly unsettling. The events of recent days, the tape recorder, the tense conversation with Jacob spun in my mind, refusing to settle. I couldn't shake the feeling that all of this was part of a larger whole, hidden beneath the veil of time. Searching for answers, I decided to visit a nearby antique shop. This place had always drawn me in with its mystical atmosphere. Old things seemed to hold the memory of the past within them. As I entered, a small bell above the door chimed melodiously, and from the depths of the shop emerged its owner, a kindly but sharp-eyed elderly man. He greeted me, and I immediately sensed he was one of those people who noticed far more than they let on. I wandered among the shelves, examining antique books, jewelry, and clocks. On one display, I spotted a music box. It resembled one my grandmother once owned, with faded flowers on its lid and a melody so soft it seemed you could only hear it in silence. A beautiful choice. The owner's voice broke the quiet. He approached, his gaze intent, as if trying to decipher what exactly I was searching for. Yes, I replied, my eyes still on the music box. It reminds me of my grandmother's home. You know, he said, carefully picking up the box. Such items often carry the energy of their owners. Music boxes especially. Their melodies can bring back memories, sometimes the ones we'd rather forget. Are you saying objects can be connected to their past? I asked, feeling a strange jolt inside me. Sometimes, yes. People leave traces behind and objects hold on to them, he said with a faint smile. But not always. Sometimes what we see in things is just a reflection of our own fears or desires. I fell silent, turning his words over in my mind. Maybe what I was experiencing truly was tied to the past. But was it all in my head? Or was there something more at play? Do you have anything else? Unusual? Something connected to voices or sounds? I asked, not entirely sure why. The man frowned slightly but kept his calm demeanor. Voices, he repeated thoughtfully. Perhaps, but such items usually require understanding. Often they tell us more about the person hearing them than about where they came from. His words stirred a strange mix of unease and curiosity within me. He handed me the music box, and I decided to buy it. It felt like an impulse, an urge to hold something from the past, to try and weave together the loose threads. As I was leaving, the man caught my eye. Be careful with memories, he said quietly. Sometimes they take us to places we'd be better off avoiding. His words felt like a warning, but I already knew I'd gone too far to turn back. The music box in my hands felt heavy, as though its weight was more than just wood and metal. On my way home, I realized the shop wasn't just a store. It felt like a door, cracked open just enough to offer a glimpse of something greater. But where that door led remained a mystery. The idea to visit an escape room was Jacob's. He called me in the evening, suggesting it with a hint of humor in his voice. The theme, an abandoned theater, struck me as oddly fitting, a place where the past lingers in shadows and voices. I agreed, hoping it would help us distract ourselves. The room greeted us with a stifling atmosphere. Dim lighting, cracked walls, dusty costumes draped over mannequins, and an old piano as if waiting for someone to play it. The administrator explained the rules, handed us flashlights, and we began exploring. Everything was designed to immerse us in the illusion of a truly abandoned place. The creaking floorboards, the sound of footsteps seemingly coming from the other side of the room. Remember how we used to play in the basement as kids? Jacob asked, examining a massive chest in the corner. This kind of feels like that. It does, I admitted, trying to mask the unease that mentioning the basement stirred in me. We quickly got into the game, solving puzzles, moving old books, and pressing hidden levers. But gradually, the room's atmosphere began to weigh on me. There was something off about it, as if someone unseen was watching us. One of the flashlights started flickering, and Jacob suggested we split up to find the next key faster. I stayed near the heavy curtains, searching for clues among torn posters. Suddenly, the light went out. Complete darkness enveloped me, and a chill ran down my spine. Jacob? I called, but the only reply was silence. Footsteps echoed nearby. Slow, deliberate. My breathing quickened. Jacob, this isn't funny, I said louder, my voice trembling. Then someone was right next to me. I felt warm breath on my cheek. A hand brushed against mine, gently grazing my fingers. Jacob. His presence was almost palpable. Before I could say anything, he unexpectedly leaned in and kissed me. It was surprising, but not unwelcome. When the light suddenly flickered back on, I saw his face. Jacob's eyes held the same mix of doubt and longing that I'd seen before. Sorry if that was poorly timed, he muttered, looking away. It's fine, I replied, feeling the heat rise to my cheeks. We continued the game, but there was now something unspoken between us that neither of us could ignore. When the escape room ended and we stepped out into the cool night air, Jacob broke the silence. Have you ever wondered why we're here together again after everything? I looked at him, unsure how to respond. Maybe the past really had drawn us back to each other. Or perhaps it was something bigger, something we still didn't understand. One thing was clear. After tonight, our relationship would never be the same. The next day, Jacob suggested we meet by the waterfront. It seemed like the perfect spot for a calm conversation, yet I felt a heavy weight inside me. After everything that had happened, the tape recorder, the antique shop, the escape room, and that kiss, questions had piled up like storm clouds. He was waiting for me at the old wooden pier. The waves gently lapped against the supports, and the air was thick with a salty chill. We sat on a bench overlooking the endless horizon. "How are you?" I asked, trying to break the tension. "It's hard to say," he replied, avoiding my gaze. "These past few days, they feel wrong, like everything's coming back." "Everything? You mean our childhood?" I asked, studying him closely. He nodded, finally looking at me. "You feel it too, don't you? It's not just the tape recorder or the basement. It's something bigger, something we didn't understand back then." I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts. "You were at my place that night, weren't you?" I asked directly. My voice was steady, but inside I was trembling. Jacob was silent for a long time. His eyes were fixed on the waves, as if searching for answers in their steady rhythm. Finally, he exhaled. "Yes, I was. But it was strange." He trailed off, struggling to find the words. "Strange? How?" I leaned in closer. "I don't remember how I got there," he said softly. "I was at home, and then suddenly I was at your door. It's like it wasn't my decision to come." His words hung in the air. I stared at him, trying to determine if he was telling the truth. His eyes held so much confusion and fear that I couldn't doubt him. "Something is pulling us back," he continued, "to the basement, to what we went through. And it's not just memories. It's like something is alive inside us. Something that's never left." "But what?" I almost shouted. "What is it? Why is this happening now?" Jacob shook his head. "I don't know. But I feel like it all started there, in our childhood. And I think we'll have to go back there to understand." The idea of returning to the basement sent a chill down my spine. But he was right. We couldn't just ignore everything that had happened. "All right," I said, looking directly into his eyes. "We'll go back, but only together." He nodded, and in that moment I felt a strange mix of fear and determination. We both knew this wouldn't just be a journey into our past. It would be a confrontation with something that had shaped us then and continued to shape us now. We decided not to delay. The next evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, we met outside my grandmother's old house. Driving up, I noticed dark clouds gathering on the horizon, as if nature itself sensed what lay ahead for us. Jacob was waiting at the gate. His face seemed calm, but I could see his fists clenching and unclenching. In silence, we walked to the door, which creaked loudly, almost as if it were warning us not to enter. "Are you ready?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "No," he admitted honestly. "But when have we ever been ready for anything?" We turned on our flashlights and headed down into the basement. Inside, everything looked the same as during my previous visits. Dusty walls, crates, and remnants of our childhood games. But this time, there was something else. The atmosphere was thick, almost tangible, as if the room itself was alive, breathing. We began searching. Jacob went to our old wardrobe of crates, while I explored the walls where, as kids, we'd believed we could hear sounds. "Are you sure you don't remember anything?" I asked without turning around. "Just fragments," he replied quietly. Whispers, cold air, the feeling that someone was standing right behind me. but I do remember that we decided not to tell the adults. We thought it was our secret. I kept running my hand along the wall until my fingers caught on something. A small crack, nearly imperceptible. I looked closer and realized it was a door, an old one camouflaged to blend into the wall. "Jacob," I called. He came over and together we started clearing away the dirt and cobwebs. Beneath it was a narrow opening leading to another room. We shone our flashlights inside and stepped through. The space was smaller than the basement, but the atmosphere was even heavier. Strange symbols covered the walls, drawn in what looked like a hurried hand. In the center stood a round table piled with papers, drawings, and photographs. I picked one up. It was an old, faded photo of two children, Jacob and me. We were standing in front of the house, but our expressions were different. Troubled, as if we already knew something was wrong. "What is this?" I whispered, showing Jacob the photograph. He stared at it, his eyes widening. "We couldn't have done this. Someone else. But why is it here?" On the table, we found more bizarre items. Letters written in childish handwriting, but with words we didn't recognize. They spoke of a dark figure and voices in the walls. Suddenly, we heard a sound. At first, it was a faint rustling. Then, footsteps. They came from behind us, from the basement. Jacob froze, and I felt the blood drain from my face. "Who's there?" he shouted, sweeping his flashlight toward the noise. No response. Only a chilling, piercing cold. We both knew. Whatever it was, it already knew we were here. And with each passing second, its presence felt closer, more undeniable. "We need to get out of here," Jacob said sharply, grabbing my hand. But I hesitated. Something was holding me back, as if a part of me needed to see this through. "Number. If we leave now, we'll never know what this is," I said. For the first time in a long while, Jacob looked at me as if he understood I was right. We stayed. We stayed, despite the fear that pierced us to our very cores. Before continuing our search, Jacob suggested we take a moment to pause and process everything we had found. We sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, our flashlights aimed toward the strange room. "Have you ever wondered," he began, not looking at me, "why we're so drawn to this place? Why everything started again, right now?" "I think about it constantly," I admitted. "Everything we've seen, the recordings, the photographs, it feels like someone deliberately left these clues for us, like they want us to remember. Or to never forget," he said softly. The silence in the basement grew heavier after those words. I couldn't shake the thought that the room, the symbols, the photographs, they were all connected to us. Whatever was hiding here had been a part of us since childhood. Jacob seemed to be thinking the same thing. We decided to go back to the papers we had found. One of the letters, written in a child's handwriting, stood out. It read, "We can never leave until we remember. Until we face the one who has always been with us." The words burned into my mind. Jacob and I exchanged a glance, and in his eyes, I saw the same mix of fear and determination I felt. "Whatever this is, it's tied to us," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "It's no coincidence this is all happening now. We have to see this through."